Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you're new here. On this channel, I talk mainly about note-taking, and specifically the note-taking method called the Zettelkasten system. If you haven't already heard of the Zettelkasten system from me or somebody else, then I definitely encourage you to check it out. You can learn more about it in my other video here. It makes note-taking fun and easy, and I highly recommend it. And for those that don't know already, I have an Instagram now, and part of the reason that I started an Instagram account was so that you could contact me more directly than by YouTube comments. And some of you have already found me on Instagram and started reaching out to me with questions about your Zettelkasten, so thank you so much for finding me and reaching out. And that includes Caro, who sent me this message the other day, and I thought that I would answer Caro's questions in a video so that we can all learn together. And Caro's question is a bit of a two-parter, so I'm going to answer the first part in this video and the second part in another video coming soon. So now to Caro's question. Caro writes, "Hello Morgan, I really enjoy your videos and your insights in your Zettelkasten, also because the ideas you always talk about are so interesting. I just have some questions about using a Zettelkasten for lecture notes, and maybe some ideas on how to use it for the natural sciences." So this video is going to be about the lecture notes. The next video is going to be about taking notes in your Zettelkasten about things that on surface level might seem less creative or fun or interesting. So let's take a look for now specifically at Caro's question about lecture notes. Caro writes, "Normally, when you," meaning me, "show how to start taking notes, you'd start from a literature note. But then, would I take the whole lecture in the literature note? Or do I take individual concepts I learned about in a lecture and put those as individual notes in the Zettelkasten and then link them together? So kind of like making my own Wikipedia." Great question, Caro. The kind of ontology of a literature note versus a individual note, or what I just call the permanent notes, and I've called recently in other videos notes. This is a super important concept, and then you're also touching on how to connect between the notes on a single lecture, and then I would also add, connect between the notes on that lecture and the wider Zettelkasten, which is kind of the more difficult thing. It's easy to connect together ideas that happened in the same lecture, but to connect those ideas to seemingly disparate things in the rest of your Zettelkasten, how are we doing that? Because that's super important in making your Zettelkasten work for you. To answer these questions, I am going to jump into an Obsidian note so that I can give you a really specific example of when I took notes on a lecture. I started my Zettelkasten in around 2020 when a global pandemic started sweeping humanity, so I wasn't attending many lectures at that time, and I had already finished coursework, so I wasn't taking notes during class within my Zettelkasten, but I did attend a Zoom conference, and I happened to catch this lecture by Natalie Lovelace called Why Research Creation, Artistic Method, and the Anthropocene, and that happened at the Imagining Differently conference at York University over Zoom, and this was the keynote address. And just a note before I get too deeply into this, everything that I'm saying is how I approach the Zettelkasten. I expect you to do something slightly different. I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but how I do it and would do it if I was taking notes on class is I would open a new note for the lecture itself. And if you're taking notes for a class, you could do this one of two ways, I think. You could either make a note for the class as a whole and then take all of your class notes in that one note, or you could make an individual note for each of the lectures in that class, so you end up maybe having 10 to 12 notes for the class. And these are your literature note, or your source note is what I tend to call them, because source notes are not always referring to literature, like in this case. We're taking notes on a lecture, and the lecture is the source of the information that we're sticking into our Zettelkasten. So to answer your question about whether you start taking notes within a literature note, yes, that is what I do. I don't start with individual notes, I start with a literature note. And at the top of that note, I put the MLA formatted citation for the source. In this case, a keynote address. In your case, you would put the specific date of the lecture that you attended, the title of the lecture you attended, even if the title is just week 1. You'd put the name of the course in italics here if you're using MLA. You'd write the name of your university, you would write the location of your university, and then instead of keynote address, you would write class lecture. So my preference when taking notes for class would be to turn every single class lecture into its own literature or source note. This is a digital system, so it's not like taking more notes is going to clutter your apartment. So you might as well make more notes so that you can be more specific when linking to those notes later. And then if you do have lots of lectures in a class, like if it's a full year class and you've got like 25 different notes from that class, that's fine, because on the left-hand side of your screen in Obsidian anyway, they are going to start piling up. Like you see, I've got like 7 different notes on Bruno Latour here. That's kind of convenient because now if I'm in the L section, say these were class lectures Bruno Latour gave me, I can see all of those class lectures in one little area. So once you've made your source note for this lecture that you've sat down to take notes in, I would then, yes, write out all of your lecture notes for that lecture. If you're allowed to take a voice recording of that lecture, because say you have accommodations, then I would voice record it and then I would go home and put it through a transcript machine and make a little transcript, and I would literally copy and paste the entire transcript into my source note for this lecture. So yeah, you can literally put the entire lecture into your Obsidian, as long as you know that's what you've done so that you don't end up plagiarizing that person's words later. If there are lots of slides with lots of content on them in this lecture, or maybe it's an art history lecture and so there's lots of images that you need to associate with the things they're talking about, you could also turn those slides into a PDF or snap pictures of them in class and also stick them into your Obsidian. Again, so long as you are not sharing those slides with others, because it is not your property, and you're just using them for your own reference for your own work later. If this lecturer just talks and there's no media, and if you don't have access to a transcript of the talk, or you don't have accommodations that allow you to take recordings because you are not allowed typically to just take a recording of your course lecture. A lecture is the property of a professor, so you require consent if you're going to record their lecture. You can't just do that, so please don't just do that. So anyway, if you don't have the original primary source, then you're going to take notes as best you can as that person talks. Anything that they say that seems important for a test later, or that you might use in an essay, or that you just find really interesting, you're going to take a note about that. And I actually encourage you to do this anyway, even if you're going to get a transcript of it later, because different things are going to pop out at you during the lecture than will in a transcript later. And also, if you're taking notes, you're paying better attention the first time, which is going to make everything easier to remember later. So even when they're talking and you're like, oh, this bit's not so interesting to me, honestly, I encourage you to keep taking notes anyway, even if you're taking notes on the fact that this is not interesting to you. Make notes about it just so that you are forced to continue listening to them talk, especially in like a 3-hour long lecture. We can start to tune out, but if you're actively taking notes about things that interest you, even if they're not exactly the content itself, that's going to be better for you to remember what has been said in those 3 hours in the long run, if you're able to do that. In the case of these lecture notes that I was taking, I did not have access to a transcript and I was taking live notes on my own. So here's what my notes looked like as I was taking notes. I wrote, the Anthropocene misplaces the actual issues that are affecting geological structures. It is not humans, the species, that are affecting the planet so extremely, it's human practices. Anyway, I just paraphrased things that I thought were interesting in Lovelace's talk, and then I wrote directly after them in the same paragraph, source, Loveless Natalie 2021, Why Research Creation. That original source note. So that I know, even though these things aren't in quotes, these are ideas that came out of that talk. I'm associating the source directly to the things in this paragraph. And then in the next paragraph, I wrote, however, and Morgan speaking here. And then I started linking to things and making notes on my own, things that interested me, things that related to other stuff in my Zettelkasten system. And maybe I took those notes as the talk was happening when Lovelace moved on to other things and I was still on this topic to keep my mind going. Or maybe I came back to this note later and I added things to it because I didn't have time during the talk, but I wanted to make sure I was connecting to other knowledges. So those are the kinds of notes that I was making during the lecture. Now, when I first took these notes, I didn't take it in a note called Alternatives to Anthropocene, blah, blah, blah. Rather, I took the notes directly in this source note. So I'd be like, I am writing in this lecture. And then once my page was full of those lecture notes, I went back through and I turned everything that I had taken notes about into an individual note. And I would do that after the lecture was over because it also takes time to figure out where to divide these ideas up into really individual ideas and then come up with a title for them that encapsulates the kind of thesis of this note. And I ended up turning all of the notes that I took during this lecture into their own individual notes so that now this note itself is empty, and then the only actual content in this main source note is the description of the talk itself, because that can be a useful thing to have. If I'm, say, writing something where I want to reference Natalie Lovelace's talk in the future, now your class lecture might not have a literal talk description, but it might. In your syllabus, there might be a little mini description of what you're going to do that week, in which case stick it in here and put it in quotes and say that it came from the syllabus. Otherwise, you might want to summarize the lecture on your own, just so that when you enter this source note, you can see at a glance what this lecture was about. Another aspect of Caro's question was asking if this was kind of like a personal Wikipedia, and that's sort of correct, but it's way better than that, and I want to show you why. Lovelace's talk was specifically about research creation, so if I'm thinking about research creation, I might want to know that I have a lecture specifically in my Zettelkasten about research creation. So I'm actually going to link directly to research creation here by putting square brackets around the words research creation in this talk description. So now I've made a link to research creation. And this is like what happens in Wikipedia, right? If I went to a Wikipedia page for Lovelace's talk, Why Research Creation, Wikipedia is going to give me a link directly to the note for research creation within this talk, because it is talking about it and there's a note for research creation. Now, if I click on research creation, in my case, in my Obsidian, on the right-hand side, I can see a backlink to Lovelace's talk. So now that I'm in research creation, I can know that there is a talk by Natalie Lovelace that discusses research creation, and I can access that talk. In Wikipedia, if I was in the Wikipedia page for research creation, it's less likely there's going to be a link back to Lovelace's talk, because research creation is an idea much bigger than Lovelace. So in Wikipedia, if I was in the research creation page, I'm never going to find Lovelace's talk, because Wikipedia doesn't have the same backlink structure as a Zettelkasten has. It only has links out. The other thing that makes your Zettelkasten a lot different than Wikipedia is you can write about things that literally no one else cares about. The point of Wikipedia is that other people might care about the things that you're writing down, but in a Zettelkasten, they don't have to. So for instance, when I wrote about daily practice as an aesthetic intervention, I mentioned that perhaps we could call the Zettelkasten an aesthetic intervention into research. And then I made a literal note about this weird niche thing. When I was writing about forms make worlds, I wrote something specifically about the form of writing as affecting the ideas that are expressed in the writing. And that is not a place where I discussed Lovelace at all. So I can connect to things that don't make sense to the average reader, but do make sense to me and deepens my knowledge about a topic. And the final thing that I wanted to mention by going into the note on the ecological form, which Natalie Lovelace talks about, and was the first time I had heard about the ecological form. In Lovelace's talk, she actually referenced a Dylan Robinson quote from his book, Hungry Listening. So of course I wrote that down, but then I actually also went and made a note for Dylan Robinson's book, Hungry Listening, even though I hadn't read that book. So if I click in there, you can see that I've pasted the quote that Lovelace quoted in their talk. And then in the brackets, just to remember that I haven't read this book, I read this quote somewhere else. I wrote Robinson 15, quoted by Natalie Lovelace, in this note here. And then I can go back to that note and see the context in which she was quoting it. And especially in a classroom environment where you are being asked to make connections between the things that you're reading, or in like a literature review context where you want to discuss everything everybody in a field has said about one topic, it can be really useful to do that kind of work in your Zettelkasten where you say who is quoting what, where, and why. So that's just something else to keep in mind as you're taking class notes. Even if you haven't read the thing that your professor is discussing, you could still put that down and you could still add a source note for that thing so that you have a reference to it. And then you'll also remember to go read that thing later if it becomes important to your research. Okay, I think that that's all I wanted to say on this topic, and I went on for way longer than I thought I was going to, but let's just go back to Caro's original question to make sure. So Caro had asked, would I take the whole lecture in the literature note? My answer is yes. Make a literature note for the lecture and then write all of your notes about the lecture in that literature note. And then Caro asks, or do I take the individual concepts I learned about in a lecture and put those as individual notes in the Zettelkasten? Also, yes. So first, put them all in the literature note, And then after the lecture is over, when you have more time on your hands, turn each of those notes, each of those ideas, separate ideas, into their own individual notes and title them after what the idea is and link them back to the original lecture so that you know where you got them from and you don't risk plagiarism. And then Caro asks, do I then link them together? Also, yes, definitely link between the notes within the lecture if that makes sense to do so, but also link them to other ideas in your Zettelkasten, or if they seem particularly important, then add new ideas to your Zettelkasten so that you have formed that link already, even if you don't populate that new note yet, just like I did with the Dylan Robinson book. And then finally, so it's kind of like making my own Wikipedia, yes and no. Yes, in that you are linking to important concepts from an original concept, but no, in that those new concepts, you can see the backlink, so you can see what it's connected to. And no, in that you can add your own personal details to the notes that you're making that maybe nobody else cares about. So I hope this has been helpful, Caro, and anybody else watching this video. And in my next video, part 2 to this one, I'm going to answer Caro's other question about how to make work in a natural sciencey Zettelkasten more fun, and how to write notes with new ideas and creativity, even if you are writing about rocks. Follow me on Instagram for bookish content and to ask me questions about your Zettelkasten, and I'll see you in another video, probably a part 2 to this one, very soon. Bye!